Hey, and welcome back to another episode. If you ever felt the weight of leading in a world where regulations amplify every pressure and demand of your job, this episode is for you. Edward Bjurstrom's career spans chemical engineering roots, 18 plus years of growing Amgen from startup to a powerhouse company, and leading at Gilead Sciences, where he oversaw critical manufacturing. And now he's in a coaching and consulting space for folks who are in highly regulated environments. He understands the silent killers of burnout and mistrust in high compliance environments, and also how value driven leadership can turn these things into strengths. So, Ed, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Glad that you're able to be here as well. And I was wondering, we all just heard your bio and everything else, but if you could just tell us in your words briefly a little bit about your 40-year experience in the biopharmaceutical industry and how we came to writing the book.
Yeah, I'd love to do that. So, graduating with a chemical engineering degree, I really was trained in how to solve problems. I went to work for a big consulting firm, and that's where I got introduced to biotechnology for the first time. And it was very intriguing. I had done some work as an engineer on essentially an oil refinery, but my first walk through a biotech plant was like an amazing experience. It was clean, it was nice. They had a lot of really interesting equipment. So I kind of fell in love with it. I ended up pursuing that and landed a job working at Amgen when they were very small back in essentially the mid 1980s. And I grew with the company. It was a remarkable experience being part of a startup company that was really growing and year by year had a new product that was very important, a kind of a groundbreaking opportunity to be a part of launching a brand new pharmaceutical that really enhanced the well-being of people's lives as a treatment for severe anemia. I stayed there at Amgen for 18 years and progressively grew into different leadership positions. I had the opportunity to work in a couple of different departments: engineering, construction, logistics, now called supply chain, and ended up in manufacturing, overseeing plants in a half dozen different locations. Had 1,500 people working for me in a lot of different geographic locations. It was very busy. I ended up leaving there and starting my own consulting company. And I was working with a lot of startup companies that, had very promising products and scientists, but they didn't know anything about that transition from being research oriented to, commercialization, dealing with the FDA and that kind of thing. So that was where, I spent a lot of time working with folks to help them understand that transition. And then, during the downturn in the, 2009, 10 timeframe, consulting work kind of dried up and I went to work for Gilead Sciences, which is another a big change. They're more of an ethical pharmaceutical company. They have less biotech, at least at that point. Now they're really big into oncology. I learned a lot about people working in a challenging environment because it's a highly regulated environment. And that accentuates the normal pressures of business and leadership when you've got a whole lot of regulatory burden to try to manage as well. And so when I retired from Gilead, I decided it would be fun to write a book. I had no idea how much work it would be. And my real objective was to try to define, summarize, and make available all the things that I learned over my 40-year career in the biotech industry so that, people who are doing really important work, making life-saving drugs will maybe not make as many mistakes as I did. So, they can learn, from my experience. And so it's been a remarkable journey to get to this place where it's now published.
That's amazing. And I love talking to people from all different backgrounds and different industries. And coming from the pharmaceutical industry, you mentioned something I wanted to touch on a little bit because you said, you highlighted that they're an ethical one versus unethical. And I was just curious about what you meant by that.
Yeah, the definition might be a little confusing to the average person. It's not ethical versus unethical. Ethical is really the chemistry oriented, what people think of normally in the context of, pharmaceutical, products being chemically based as opposed to biotech, which is primarily protein based. And, the big advent back in the, late 70s through the 80s was the development of biotechnology where proteins that mimic normal proteins in the body are manufactured synthetically. And your body can't really tell the difference between a normal, part of your physiology and a biotech product in terms of the protein. And it has some really significant effects. I mean, the biotech industry has developed some really amazing products that treat various ailments like rheumatoid arthritis, which, people suffered terrible pain for many years. And now that's been a significant improvement, and so many others as well.
That's awesome. So, what is there one specific area that when you got into leadership and leading teams and leading organizations, especially geographically dispersed, is there something that really stuck out as a defining moment for you in your leadership philosophy?
Yeah, I think the one of the kind of themes throughout my book is all about how people think, or sometimes, unfortunately, a lot of times they don't think, they just react. It's this interplay between the fact, you have two minds. You have an emotional mind and a rational mind. Your emotional mind, sometimes people call it your unconscious, your subconscious. I use the term emotional mind because in the work environment, most of the trouble comes from people evidencing emotional challenges and behaving emotionally rather than rationally. And that's been an incredible fascination for me for many years in terms of why do people behave the way they do. And it comes down to we all have experiences through life. Your subconscious emotional mind records all of that. It is actually very important because when you combine logic with the emotional impact of previous experiences, you can actually make wise decisions when the two work together properly. If you're hijacked by your emotional mind because you get set off by something, then not good things happen. And you can't deny your emotions. In fact, you can't deny the emotions of other people. You have to understand them, work with them, and help people get back to the place where they can think clearly, engage their rational mind without denying their emotions. And that's a challenge. And so it's a area of great interest to me, and I kind of write a lot about it. And
Yeah, so let's talk about that a little bit more, like the difference between your rationalized mind and your emotional mind. So when I'm pretty sure most people think, well, I'm a pretty logical person, that's my logical mind, but my emotional mind, what does that look like compared to my emotions?
yeah, that's a good question. Your emotions will develop almost, well, spontaneously. Something will happen, some kind of stimulus, and your emotions will come to the front. And, if something makes you afraid, you have a certain physiological reaction. It's kind of the fight or flight thing. If something makes you angry, you get a different set of physiological responses. And, if you're emotionally intelligent, or I call it really emotional maturity, um, if you're emotionally mature, you'll recognize those sensations in your body that give you an insight into what's going on with my emotion. And depending on the reality of the situation, you can react appropriately or maybe not. I mean, you could be dealing with, old past experiences where, you encounter something similar and you have an emotional response that may be very inappropriate. I'll give you an example. In the office environment, let's say you're giving a presentation and somebody asks you about your data or about your presentation, and they might express it in a slightly aggressive way, maybe not intentionally, and you could react defensively and even angrily if you are allowing your emotions to. Alternately, you can take a breath and try to understand, well, why do you ask that question? How can I clarify? Asking back a question rather than just reacting, you can respond. And, maybe the person was just trying to understand something that seemed a little confusing.
Yeah, so you mentioned that you worked in a heavily federally regulated environment, and I'm very familiar with being in a heavy regulated federal environment. So, and you also wondered how people make the decisions that they're going to make. How often do you find that people make an emotional decision based on making a federal mistake, and instead of owning up to it, kind of panic and then end up making things worse inadvertently?
Yeah, that unfortunately that happens all too often. And, what's at play there is the idea that people are afraid. Fear is one of the fundamental emotional reactions, and it drives a lot more behavior than what people think or would even want to admit to. And so let's say you have an operator working, making a product, following an SOP. They inadvertently make a mistake. Okay. And let's just say it's not intentional, but mistakes happen. And there are all kinds of in that environment, there's all kinds of quality systems that can deal with that. But it's kind of a high risk business because if you do something that validates a batch of material, could be hundreds of thousands of dollars tied up in that raw material. So, an operator making, $25 an hour, and he made a mistake, he's got a couple of things going on. He's afraid a supervisor will yell at him. He's worried that he might get fired because, that's a big loss for the company. And so rather than, contacting his supervisor or going to the quality people and asking what he should do, he kind of hides the mistake. And then later on, when it's found, because it's almost always found eventually, the longer it takes to find it, the worse it'll be. Could affect other lots and that kind of thing. Then, he's endangered his job because if you're if you're in the business of making life-saving drugs, honesty and integrity are the key things that you want. And I've had to fire people, unfortunately, who were good workers, but they made a mistake and then they tried to hide it, and then they lied about it, and then when it was discovered, they got defensive. And in the process of letting those people find a new place to be successful, um, which is the way I look at it. I've been questioned by, the HR crowd about was, this really worth firing him over? And my response was always, if you needed a life-saving drug for your child, wouldn't you want it to be made by someone you could trust? That pretty much stopped the conversation.
Absolutely. When it comes to accountability and integrity, how can people out there who might be struggling with this in a similar industry or a different industry, where they're like, I really wish people would own up to things earlier instead of letting it compound and becoming a bigger problem? What are some things that people could do to put in their kit bag and say, this is a technique to help instill more integrity and more accountability earlier on?
Yeah, that's a great question. The fundamental thing about building, if you're a leader in an organization, trying to build an environment of trust is where it really makes a difference. The kind of recent buzzwords are psychological safety. I really prefer to focus on building trust because it's more positive. That notion of psychological safety brings up why you have to be afraid that maybe you don't have it. Building an environment where people are recognized and appreciated for bringing up a problem. Okay, so if somebody brings a problem to a leader, that leader has to make sure, number one, thank them for that, and even ask them, well, what do you think we should do about it? That engages them. You think about when there's a problem and you have to bring it to your boss, supervisor, or whatever. There's a lot of activation energy that has to go on in order to bring kind of a difficult question to your supervisor or leader. And when people do that, they need to be appreciated, recognized for it, engaged to help identify solutions to the problem. And that, when you do that one time, that worker will go out and tell 10 others that, yeah, it's okay to, bring a problem to the boss because he doesn't bite your head off. He asks for, your insights and understanding. And, a lot of people working in these environments, manufacturing or whatever, they really understand what the issues are. A lot of times the management team, the head boss, they're a little disconnected from what's really going on out on the manufacturing floor.
So, how can we help bridge that disconnection between what's really happening and what we think is really happening? Because I see it myself. We got senior folks who think, "Oh, this is what's happening," and then it's like, "What's really happening?" How do we bridge that gap to flatten organizations?
I think the one answer to that certainly is many, but one answer is to what I call ask some good questions. Here's an example of a bad question. Something happens and, the boss says, who's at fault here? That's not helpful. What he wants to say is, okay, tell me what happened, kind of stay as calm as possible, try to understand the circumstances surrounding it. And, ask, then follow up with like, well, what can we do? How can we prevent this in the future? And those are all very helpful, good questions. Sometimes if people are just questioning, what you're trying to do as a leader, asking a question like, well, why do you think that? It opens the door for dialogue. A lot of people think that discussing a problem and trying to figure out the solution is the right way to go. They miss something really important in that. And that is dialogue before you start discussing. Because in dialogue, people share ideas and they help to clarify what the problem really is. And trying to discuss a solution to a problem before you have agreement on what the problem is, kind of sets everybody up for conflict and confusion, a lot of wasted time.
Absolutely. And so, when it comes to our rationalized mind versus our emotional mind, what do you think overrides, or do you think we can pick and choose which side we want to use?
A lot of times people aren't aware of the emotional mind's influence. So, if you start getting some of those body sensations, you have to ask yourself some good questions sometimes, like, I'm feeling frustrated or angry. You do this in your head. frustrated and angry. Is that appropriate given what is really happening here? And you can kind of talk yourself through that. The psychologists have a very fancy term for that. It's called metacognition, which literally means you're thinking about the way you're thinking.
Yep.
And a lot of people don't actually do that very much. I remember early in my career, and I was kind of learning about how to manage my own emotions, and I've been continuing to grow in that, and I wasn't really good at it early on. I remember driving home from work one day, and I was very unhappy and upset. And I started trying to analyze why. And I realized that I had no good reason for that. I can't even remember now what the issues were, but they weren't worth being upset or angry or, that kind of thing.
Right. So when we talk about those things, I'm just curious as to how often one overrides the other. Do we think that we can choose to stick with our logical mind, or do you think the emotional side takes over?
Yeah, when the emotional side takes over, it's called emotional hijacking. And that can lead to a lot of, unfortunate situations and problems. Going back to the idea that, if you have, a level of emotional intelligence where you can recognize, hey, I'm feeling angry. And then you can actually take a breath, analyze the situation rationally, and manage that emotion. That's actually almost the definition of, a significant level of emotional intelligence or emotional maturity. The emotions are always going to be there. Okay. Fear being one of the big ones, anger being another big one. I'll give you an example of fear comes up in so many circumstances, but one that a lot of people can relate to is like the fear of getting up and speaking in front of a large group. And, a lot of people are really nervous about that and they're fearful of it. It comes from the fact that people, want to look good. They want to be right. They want to be in control. And if they get up in front of a bunch of people and stumble around and they're worried about looking foolish and saying the wrong thing and nobody cares about what nobody's listening. That's a pretty common one. And, the way you conquer, there's a very specific process for anybody who wants to give a public speaking opportunity, very specific process for, kind of developing how to do that properly. And even experienced speakers will always be a little bit nervous, quote unquote, coming up, to the microphone, walking up to the stage and all. But you can learn over time, and it does take practice, to where you can take that nervous energy and put that energy in your opening comments, engage with the audience because you've got a message that's important for them to hear. They want to hear it. You come across as energetic, engaged, and people can really appreciate what you have to say. Now, that actually is another really good example of how you can enter this mental state called flow, which is high concentration, low concern about yourself in terms of your image or whatever. And, you kind of lose track of time. And it's actually a very wonderful experience. And, the notion of becoming fearless in your presentation has another fancy word, hypofrontality, transient hypofrontality, which you kind of lose your concern about your own image and how well you're coming across. You just kind of flow into the presentation itself.
No, I'm glad you brought up flow because I was actually going to ask you about flow state and if you could just define it for what everybody is in case people don't know what it is, and then how we can get into group flow state and how we can set those expectations.
Yeah, it's another really fascinating area. I've experienced this phenomena or mental state of flow many times before I had the verbiage to articulate exactly what it is and how you get there. One of the most important things, kind of the real criteria, is you have to have a really important goal, something that you're trying to accomplish. You have to have some risk associated with it, risk of failure, but you're not concerned about that because you have the skills to meet the challenge. And there's this skill challenge balance that happens on individual flow where, if the challenge is much greater than your skill, you'll be anxious and you won't get into flow. If you have, more skills than the challenge needs, you get bored and that doesn't work either. But if they're pretty close and maybe the challenge is just a little bit more than your skill, and that kind of brings up the risk factors, which focus your attention and energy, you can get into a flow and accomplish some amazing things. This notion of your brain is a chemical factory, and you get a bunch of different neurotropic factors that come into play that increase your ability to recognize patterns, increase your creativity, increase focus, and all of those things work together to help you be much more productive. It is a strain on the brain, though, so you can't really keep it up for more than an hour and a half or 2 hours. And then you need to go into kind of a recovery phase. But you can accomplish more in those 2 hours than a lot of people accomplish in, 2 days.
Wow. Yeah.
Yeah, and so the the notion of flow is not that widely known, but there's a lot of literature about it. Stephen Kotler is kind of one of the big, proponents at the point. There is this Hungarian guy, Set Me High, who wrote the original book on it. But there's another this idea of group flow. There was a book called Group Genius that was really a great book about kind of starts off talking about how jazz players and basketball teams work together seamlessly to do amazing and wonderful things, and then that whole concept can apply into business in lots of different ways, but it's different. There's Kevin Sawyer, who's wrote the book Herb Genius. He identified 10 different factors that come into play for a team of people to work so seamlessly together that they're mentally in sync with each other. In studying that, I actually looked it over and decided that there's some value in trying to define half of those 10. Five of them are what I call must-haves,
Okay.
and the other five are really learned behaviors. And so those are kind of that distinction is helpful for people who want to try to facilitate, a group of people getting into flow together. And one of the key things, of the must-haves has to be in place is a shared goal that has real meaning. It's aspirational and it's not going to be easy to achieve, which means that there's some shared risk amongst the team members. They all win together, they all fail together, and that everybody on the team is valued for their expertise and what they can contribute to the overall effort. The necessary or learned behaviors are things more like not being worried about your ego, for example, and that you're willing to build on what your colleagues are describing or proposing. That's sometimes referred to as the yes and thing, where, it's like an improv where, you say, a black kitten, and I don't say, no, there's no black kitten. I say, no, and the black kitten is really pretty. It's like you build on each other's, input. And so there's this synergy that develops, which is very powerful because you're actually drawing out the expertise and talent of all the different team members into what the team is trying to create itself. Of course, it goes along with being concentrated. Don't let distractions come in. You got to manage all that. But yeah, a team working, like that can accomplish amazing things in a short period of time.
Absolutely. And wondering how we could apply that to other things other than like baseball teams or basketball teams or sports arenas, and how we could bring that into the business world. Because I think that would be truly amazing if we could create environments where teams could get into like group flow states and then and what that would look like.
Yeah, it actually happens more often than people recognize, number one. Back in the day, it used to be called a high performance team, and it was always kind of an elusive thing. There was a lot of literature written about it, but, people generally don't experience that on a continuous basis. But I'll give you an example when it happens, not just in the pharmaceutical business, but in any business that's facing a crisis. I was involved in one facility where, basically speaking, we had a problem in the manufacturing area that was probably going to cause a recall of a product and maybe some action by the FDA. And, when that happens at that level, the management team is fundamentally at risk for their job. Because it's that serious. And I remember that occasion where, as a team, we got together. People left their egos at the door. It was just focused on trying to solve the issue, deal with the problem, mitigate the risks, and people do amazing work in the context of an emergency. And you come out of that, there's camaraderie, diligent work, creative thinking, focus, and you come out of that and you wonder, why do we need an emergency in order to generate this kind of teamwork? Because once the emergency has passed, and those situations, they might last for a week or two, certainly not even a month, unless it's a dire emergency, and then you might be in it for a while. But usually that first team deals with all of the current challenges, and then they hand it off for implementation of mitigation measures and follow up, and that to another group. But during that period of time, intense work, 18 hours a day, people working selflessly, it's amazing. I've experienced it a few times. You wonder, can't we get something like this on a regular basis?
You bring that up as an interesting point because you mentioned before that the goal has to be aspirational and it's got to be challenging enough. So I'm wondering, if as we work on a daily basis, we kind of lull ourselves and lower the expectation. And then when the emergency and crisis hits it escalates that vision because our jobs are on the line. And it goes,
Right.
oh, well, now we must do the same thing that we probably should have been doing all along. That's just something that came to mind when you mentioned that. I was like, well, I wonder if it's because of the increase in stress and elevation and goal that you have to achieve.
Yeah, it's the risk factors involved for sure. It drives focus and attention and everything else. Even leadership teams that have been together for, a couple of years, they start to lose that aspirational sense. And what happens is the normal course of things is that the members of the team will change out every time that happens. Well, they need to regroup and make sure that everybody's redefined their role, the norms that everybody's committed to keeping, values of the team. And, you just need to mix it up once in a while to kind of re energize. People get complacent over time, and, that's not always a good thing.
No, absolutely. Complacency definitely kills. So I fight complacency all the time and everything. It's like my number one enemy that I'm always looking for. So I'm glad that you brought that up, Ed. So my last question is there anything that we haven't talked about, or did I not ask you a question that you were like, you know what? I really wish that you would ask me this one question.
Yeah, thanks. There's a lot of different approaches and evidence in my book about leadership success in, a lot of different environments. The one thing people don't typically understand very well, if you're a leader, you really need to become an excellent storyteller. Okay. Stories are, kind of the secret weapon of a leader because you can convey sometimes a hard message to people and, with a story that they'll accept and be able to internalize. Whereas if you just gave the facts, well, they might be defensive, resistive. And that's like, if you're trying to make a significant change, people become fearful. But if you give the story about, why it's important, where it's going to lead to, why it's going to enhance the success of everybody, in the company or in the organization, people will accept that and be able to engage on that rather than become fearful and defensive. And, there's a methodology for building a story. Every story has a hero. Every story has a villain. Every story has a quest. In leading large organizations, as the leader, I was not the hero. Okay. The people who actually are in the plant doing the work, making the life saving drugs day in and day out, dealing with the challenges, those are the heroes. I was only the guide, and the quest was to accomplish this very important life saving, process, building drugs that actually save lives. If you're building widgets, it might be a little harder to engage people, but the work that people do to advance the goals of the company, they're the heroes. Management are just the guides. They're responsible for providing resources, direction, assistance, but the heroes do the work on a day-to-day basis. And there's a lot about storytelling that can really enhance a leader's capability and success.
Absolutely. And I appreciate you sharing that with everybody. And for everyone watching and listening to this, go to the descriptions. You're going to be able to find the links to Ed's book. I'll put your LinkedIn if that's okay
Sure.
with you as well. So that way people can reach out to you and get more of everything that you have to offer. Because this is just like a little tip of the iceberg of everything that you have to offer. Wealth of knowledge. Everyone's going to be able to benefit from it. So I appreciate you coming on here and sharing that with everybody. So thank you so much, Ed.
Been my pleasure. Thank you.